I don't need any more wine. I'm still gonna drink more wine. I gotta move over slightly. There we go. All right. Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. I am Britt, and if you've been subscribed yet, you probably should, because I normally talk about geeky things, but sometimes I tell you guys stories about the reasons why I drink. Welcome to Wine Storytime. So I told you guys a lot of stories about my younger life. I'm going to tell you guys actually probably the most recent wine story time that I have planned. So this one's actually relatively recently. This happened in 2013. And this is the story about when we thought I was dying. So this is a fun one. So I had started working for Caribou Coffee, which is a chain of coffee shops here in Minnesota. It used to be nationwide, but the company was bought out by the same company that owns Peet's Coffee. And so wherever Peet's Coffee was doing really, really well, they switched out to make Caribou. So for the most part, Caribou only really exists in Minnesota, western Wisconsin, not eastern Wisconsin, western Wisconsin, and the East Coast, and then a bunch of airports, which is where apparently Caribou Coffee did really well. But it's based here in Minnesota. It was started in Minnesota, and it was a really great place to work. Shortly after I started working at Caribou Coffee, I started experiencing these really strange symptoms. These are symptoms that I would not really wish on my worst enemy. I would wake up incredibly nauseous with the weirdest headache, and I later found out that it was actually a migraine, but it is like what doctors sometimes call a painless migraine. So while there was pain, it wasn't like the kind of pain you experience with a migraine. I had all the other symptoms of migraine, but the only issue that I had, the only thing that it wasn't, was ridiculously painful. So I would have like a headache, but I would be nauseous, I would be light sensitive, all this stuff. And so apparently doctors call it a painless migraine. There was more pressure than there was pain. And this happened nearly every single morning. And it would end with me throwing up. And it was like clockwork. I would throw up between 9 and 10 every single day. So the first time this happened, I woke up, I overslept. I woke up feeling sicker than hell. The way that I could explain it was if I felt like I had a hangover, but I didn't drink the night before. I mean, I might have, but I don't get drunk. I may tell you guys the stories why I drink, but I don't get drunk. Like, ever. I have been drunk less than 10 times in my entire life, and I'm 32. 7? But I felt like I had a hangover. And I ended up being late for work. It was one of my training days, and my boss texted me and said, hey, where are you? And I just missed on the calendar that I was supposed to go in for a training session an hour before my actual shift. And so I was like, shoot, I'm on my way. She goes, no worries, you're still new, like, this happens. So I got there, I was feeling like hell. She even said, you don't look so good, what's going on? And I said, I am just not feeling great. That's what I told her. I said, I feel like I have a hangover, but I didn't have fun the night before. And she goes, that sounds awful. And it was awful. I felt miserable. This was my first time experiencing this. And so I was just really not feeling good. She said that I looked incredibly pale. So I was apparently looking pale, like almost green. She could tell I wasn't feeling well. She was tempted to send me home, like, no, I can do this, I'm fine. So she needed to go take care of a problem, and she's like, just give me a minute. I said, that's fine, I'm gonna go use the restroom anyway. And I went to use the restroom, and next thing I knew, I was glad I was in the restroom because I was throwing up. And I felt like $1 million afterwards. I threw up, and my headache was gone, my nausea was gone. My boss even said, what happened? Your color is completely back. I did eventually tell her that I threw up. After all of this was kind of figured out, I finally did tell her that day I had thrown up, and it was the first time that this had happened. My mom had been urging me to go to the doctor and figure out what's going on, and I'm just like, no, it's fine. Like, I was just gonna kind of deal with it, live with it, just move on. Until I started dry heaving instead of throwing up. And some other weird symptoms popped up. Like, it just was very strange. I felt like I was dying. I legitimately felt like I was dying, and it was scary. And I didn't know what to think. And so, of course, I did the thing you shouldn't do, and that's Google. What popped up with the symptoms that I was expressing, I don't even necessarily remember all of the symptoms anymore. And if I actually said all the symptoms, I'm sure people would be like, you're lying. Like, those are not the symptoms you have. They look up the symptoms of a brain aneurysm, because those were the symptoms I was experiencing, minus the seizures. And so then all of a sudden I went, oh my God, I have a brain aneurysm. And I was terrified. So once I started dry heaving, that was when I finally caved and told my mom, yeah, you know what, I'm gonna go get this checked out. And I told her I don't want to be alone, because at this point I'd already Googled it, and was already afraid of brain aneurysm, but I didn't want to say anything to my mom because I didn't want to like worry her more. I didn't want to worry her without cause. I really didn't say anything to anybody. I was trying really hard to just keep it quiet. I was still making YouTube videos at this point. Like, I was absolutely terrified. If you go back to my videos in 2013, you'll see as I'm going through this, because you'll see me drinking a lot of Caribou coffee while I'm making my videos, like my rant out of love of Doctor Who with River Song. I was drinking a black iced tea during that. You'll see a lot of my old Instagram videos and pictures and stuff of me drinking caffeine, and then all of a sudden there's one video on my channel, I think it's still public, where I talked about getting a needle in your arm, right here on your forearm, and how that really hurts. It's really, really painful. And I don't know if I ever really opened up about what was going on YouTube. I don't think I did. Because it was a very scary time. I didn't say anything about anything. I didn't say to anybody about anything at work. I didn't say anything to anybody in my personal life. Like, my YouTube friends, they know now, but my YouTube friends at the time really had no idea what I was going through. The only people that really knew were my mom and my dad about what I was experiencing, what I was going through. My mom had already kind of come up with her own fear as well. And I had seen two possible prognoses with the symptoms I was experiencing. And the one that was more realistic was the brain aneurysm. The one that was less realistic, but still possible, was a brain tumor. Both of them were absolutely terrifying to me. But my mom was already thinking brain tumor, and I was thinking brain aneurysm. And so we got to the doctor, and he's like one of the best doctors in the system that I went to. And he said, I think it's important that we do an MRI just to make sure. And I said, make sure of what? And he said that you don't have a brain aneurysm or a brain tumor. I had never experienced anxiety like I had in that moment, and the weeks following that moment, until we got the results back of my MRI. I was terrified. And this is when I started talking to people about it a little bit, was because I knew I was going to be a mess. And as you can tell, it's still hard for me to think about and talk about, because it was one of the scariest moments of my life. And not only that, but we had just endless amounts of medical scares. You know, my grandmother, the year before that, was diagnosed with colon cancer. Then I had this, and then my dad had his heart attack, and then just everything. Then my mom ended up having breast cancer. And then my grandma's colon cancer came back. This was the start of just year after year of all these medical scares or real medical problems that my family had to experience. And it was one of the scariest times of my life, because here I am, not even 30 yet, and possibly dying. And so I asked the doctor, I said, if it is a brain aneurysm, what does that mean? And he said, well, either way, whether it's an aneurysm or whether it's a tumor, the first question is it operable? And I said, what if it's not? What if neither one of them are operable? And he goes, let's just hope they are. He scheduled me for an MRI pretty quickly, which scared me. My mom tried to make me feel better by saying, well, he didn't rush you immediately into an MRI. He didn't make this an emergency situation. But I go, but he did schedule it very quickly. And I went in for the MRI. I was in the MRI for 2.5 hours. This is when I talked about the injection. So I had half of it without contrast and then half of it with contrast. So if you guys don't know anything about MRIs, MRI is this like tube that they put you in. It's really loud. They gave me earphones, like sound canceling earphones or headphones to listen to the radio. I had asked if they could connect like my iPod or I think it was my iPhone at the time to it so I could listen to my own music. And they said, no, it's just the radio. I said, is there any, can I take a break? Can I just get out of it sometime? They asked me if I was claustrophobic, and I said no. I mean, I had some history of claustrophobia, but mostly in the sense of like, I would have dreams where I would end up crawling, like walking in a room that just kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller until I was crawling, and then it was stuck. And then that was when it would turn into a nightmare. So I had some issues with claustrophobia, but I really didn't have a ton then. I do now. I get very claustrophobic now. Like I have to go, if I can, I try really hard to go into bigger stalls because I get claustrophobic in public restrooms. I get claustrophobic in the backseat of vehicles. I need to be able to see out the front window, out the windshield, in order for me to not feel claustrophobic. It got to a point where I would consider myself claustrophobic, which I hate because I wasn't before and I am now because of the MRI. Because it was my head, I didn't have to go completely into the MRI. Most of my body was in the MRI. I think my feet were sticking out. And they needed me to stay awake because I told them, I go, if I'm just laying and doing nothing for 2 hours, I'm probably going to fall asleep. And they said, well, we're going to jerk you awake if you start to fall asleep because we need to see your brain activity and we can't let you go into a deep sleep. And it actually happened once. I started to doze off and all of a sudden I felt the MRI going whoosh, and it scared the crap out of me. I was awake after that. There was also one where there was a commercial for something. I don't remember what the commercial was about, but it had dripping water. And after that, I had to go to the bathroom. And I couldn't take a break and stuff. But they did tell me, they're like, you can't, like, doze off a lot. Like, if you doze off a lot, it's going to really mess with what's going on. And so if you doze off enough, we're going to have to keep you in there longer, or we're going to have to schedule another time. So luckily it was just the one time that I dozed off a little bit and they jerked me awake. And they pulled me out of the MRI just enough time to give me the injection for the contrast. And the only reason they went in through, actually I think it was this vein. No, it was this one. The only reason they went through this vein was because I had already had blood drawn from both arms. So I had an injection here and I had an injection here. And the reason why I had 2 injections is because I have small veins, and it's hard to find my veins. So a lot of times they'll try one arm, and then they'll have to go to the other, and they'll eventually get blood. But it's hard. It's difficult. I was severely dehydrated when I was a young kid, when I was like a year old. So my veins are very small and hard to find. And so I had 2 injections already in my little pits here. I don't know what they're called, my elbow pits. So they went in through this vein here, and this vein hurt. And I don't know if it was just the contrast needle. The contrast needle is a little different of a needle. But contrast, essentially, I don't even know what it is, but it just it just gives you a different view of the MRI. So after the MRI was done, I spent the next week of my life just scared the entire time. I was terrified. I was crying all the time. I wasn't sleeping very well. I would just randomly break out into tears in the middle of work. I had my first review during this time at Caribou, And my actual boss, so the store manager, so the girl that I was talking about, she was the assistant store manager, and she eventually became the store manager of another store, and I moved to that store. It's a whole different thing. Not really a store with Caribou. I loved Caribou. I'm sad I left Caribou, but I'm glad too, because I've met some of my best friends through Yankee, and so I can't ever really say anything bad about leaving Caribou, but I do miss Caribou, and I loved Caribou a lot. But I had my review, and so my store manager was sitting there, and he's like, "You okay?" And the second he said that, I burst into tears. I go, "I think I'm dying." And he didn't know what to do about that. And he's like, "What do you mean you think you're dying?" And I told him. And he didn't know anything at this point. He didn't know about what I was going through. And he kind of got a little angry with me a little bit in the sense of, "Why didn't you say anything about this sooner?" I said, "Because I'm scared. And I don't talk about what I'm afraid of. I don't talk about that because if I talk about it, then I cry. And then when I cry, I feel like I'm stupid. And I don't like showing people my tears. I just don't. I don't like it." I've gotten better about it. So he didn't know what to do. Much like I didn't. I was seeing my chiropractor at that point. It was very early on in my time seeing the chiropractor, and I told him about it. And he goes, "Man, just see if they'll send me the records, because I can look at them before they get back to you." And I never did. He never looked at my MRI results. But he kind of helped me through it, because he goes, "You don't show a lot of those symptoms." And I said, "But I do." And he goes, "Right, but not on the kind of scale that those kinds of diseases will show." And I said, "I guess." And right as I was leaving work one day, I got a phone call from the doctor's office. And my coworkers wouldn't let me leave because they wanted to know. And so I answered the phone, and they found nothing abnormal about my brain. Physically, I mean, emotionally, I'm a wreck, but depression, anxiety, OCD, like, just name it, and it's probably wrong with my brain. But nothing physically wrong with my brain. No aneurysm, no tumor. And I just broke down, and I sobbed in relief. And we got the blood results back, and they were very normal. I'm hypoglycemic. The only thing that was high were my ANAs. And I don't have an official diagnosis about what's wrong with me. We basically stopped there because it wasn't life-threatening. So the only thing that the doctor told me after that, he said, "Cut caffeine out of your system and see what happens." And I said, "Why?" And he goes, "Because a lot of your symptoms also involve caffeine intolerance." And I said, "But I've been drinking caffeine my whole life. Like, even when I was a kid, I was drinking Surge." He goes, "Right, but intolerances can develop over time." And he goes, "Now that you're working at Caribou Coffee, it's very possible that your caffeine intake has increased tremendously." And I go, "That's very true, it has." And he goes, "Well, so your body probably developed an intolerance to caffeine." And I said, "I've never even heard of that." He goes, "Well, you're lactose intolerant, right?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "It's kind of the same thing. If it goes into your stomach, if your enzymes aren't altogether there, or they've died off, or something is wrong in your gut, you can develop an intolerance to really anything." And I said, "I guess that makes sense." So I tested it, and I took caffeine out of my system. And for the most part, I don't have those symptoms anymore. But I do sometimes, because I still eat chocolate, and I still drink decaf coffee. And every time I do, I will have a weird little headache. Sometimes I'll get nauseous. But it's never the full-blown symptoms that I had before. So the other option is, because my ANAs were high, those are I can't remember what ANA stands for, but if your ANAs are high, it generally depicts an autoimmune disease. And there are a couple of autoimmune diseases that cause those symptoms. And most of those are based on the fact that you just dehydrate quicker than most people. And that would make a lot of sense, since I was, like, deathly dehydrated when I was a year old. Because I was lactose intolerant, still drinking dairy, we just didn't know it. I was sick at the time, so we just blamed it on those two things, and maybe had more to do with this. But I should also in those cases give up alcohol, and alcohol does not give me the symptoms unless I drink too much. But I mean, hangovers are basically just you being dehydrated anyway. So we don't have an official diagnosis of what's going on, but for the most part, at this point, we're pretty convinced, since caffeine seems to be the trigger of my symptoms, that I'm just caffeine intolerant. So, I said this on Twitter relatively recently too. So if you work at a coffee shop, never give somebody caffeine if they ask for decaf as a prank. Speaking from experience, if they are caffeine intolerant, those are symptoms you wouldn't want to wish on your worst enemy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the reasons why I drink. Because I can't have coffee anymore. So I'm going to drink the alcohol to make up for it. Let me know in the comments below some of the things that you're intolerant to. Are you lactose intolerant? Are you caffeine intolerant? I've actually met somebody that I met while in college, freshman year of college. We rekindled our friendship recently. And turns out she's also caffeine intolerant. And she experienced all the same symptoms. And so it makes me even more sure that that's what's wrong with me. But yeah, so let me know in the comments below things that you're intolerant to. Do you drink a lot of caffeine? I'm very jealous of you, especially on nights where I don't sleep well. Days where I don't sleep well the night before. I've had some rough days. Jealous of anybody who can still have caffeine, because I miss it a lot. I'll see you guys all next week. Bye. Apparently my dog did not eat dinner. So he's eating dinner now through his wobbler. So this is going to be a fun wine story time.